At points in this project, I'm going to run into some games that are barely blips on the radar for NES fans, while in Japan they were more significant. In the US, Xevious was a mildly popular arcade game and a solid but not wildly popular NES title. In Japan, Xevious was a cultural phenomenon. Xevious broke shooting games out of the boundary of the single screen and changed the genre forever. One of the very first video game strategy guides ever was written for Xevious by Satoshi Tajiri. Eventually he gave his video game company the same name as his fanzine, Game Freak. There's a generation of Japanese video game developers who played Xevious and decided that's what they want to do. Xevious had further cultural impact than that. The very first album of video game music was for Xevious, and the game's designer Masanobu Endo wrote a novel to give Xevious a backstory. I haven't been able to get a copy of that book myself, but the summaries I've read make it both sound incredibly cliched and totally bonkers. I could go on and on about all the stuff around Xevious, but that's a video for another channel. It's time to start digging into the game itself. Xevious was the game that made vertically scrolling shooters a thing. The player flies the spacecraft Solvalo across the landscape of forests, fields, and roads, fighting against the Gamp invaders. Last long enough, and you'll be attacked by one of their enormous flying saucers, one of the very first bosses in a shooting game. The Solvalo can fire shots straight ahead or bomb the ground just in front of it. Air and ground targets will approach, and you can fly over the ground targets if you don't shoot them. The landscapes that you fly over are kind of neat, because although you view them in one continuous strip, they're actually side by side. And if you cut up the map a bit, you can see the whole thing fits together. The Famicom version is the largest Famicom cart to date. It is 320 kilobits. Almost every other Famicom game so far has been 192 kilobits. I guess that's why they had to charge more for this one. But even with all that extra space to hold the landscapes, they still couldn't quite fit in everything from the arcade. The Nazca lines lie at the end of the desert section in the arcade version, and the Famicom is just a blank field. Another subtle innovation of Xevious? There are two types of enemy fighters, manned and unmanned. Any craft that the game considers manned will try to avoid hitting the player. One of the more interesting quirks of Xevious is it has scaling difficulty. The better that you play the game, the more challenging the enemies become. They become both more numerous and more aggressive. When you start a new game, they will rarely shoot at you and will kind of leisurely fly in. After a while, though, the craft variety changes and you get things that start firing rapidly and zoom toward you. The difficulty scales down when you die as well, so it gives the game a kind of gentle curve. One of the more infamous enemies in Xevious are these flying rectangles that look almost 3D rendered. The playground story goes that if someone could shoot one of these 256 times, it would explode. This isn't true, and the squares simply don't take damage. Right after you first encounter the squares, you can find another of Xevious's innovations. There's a hidden one-up. If you bomb this water here, the special flag from Rally X appears. Collect it, and you get a one-up. And we're still not done with Xevious's innovations. The Famicom game is one of the first instances of a cheat code. At the title screen, hold down the A button, and then press right 9 times, press up twice, press left twice, and then down 9 times. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a set of numbers appear. You can think of those as dip switches for the game. You select each one by pressing left and right, and change them by pressing the A or B button. The effect of the change occurs when you press reset and start a new game. The rightmost 2 bits grant the players 5 lives when they start the game. The next 2 over set the game to maximum difficulty. The enemies become super aggressive and don't stop coming. If you want a challenge, turn these on. The next three change the 1-up system. That doesn't really have a visible effect, so let's move on. The front bit, if it's turned on, the ship is invulnerable. You can drive right through those squares and it doesn't do anything. On Game Center CX, they use this to try to find out what the maximum score in Xevious could be. The arcade locks the score at 9,999,000, but the Famicom version doesn't lock the score at all. For such a simple game, there's a lot to Xevious. As for the legacy, well, Xevious as a cultural phenomenon, of course, would live on, but those kind of spawn out of the arcade game. The Famicom game's legacy, there's a direct sequel to the Famicom game called Super Xevious that we'll see pretty soon, and Xevious got a release in the final days of the Famicom Disk System as something you could buy from a Famicom Disk System rewriter kiosk. Naturally, the Famicom version was a monster hit, selling 1.25 million copies. It was the game to own for the Famicom in the winter of 1984. Xevious has so much going on around it, I completely forgot to talk about my own reactions to it. It's kind of simple, there are no power-ups to go after. The boss is iconic, but he's the only boss they have. And despite that, I find Xevious to be kind of fun to play. This is easily the most technically impressive Famicom game we've seen so far. It looks sharper and plays faster than anything before it on the system. It's technically impressive too. Besides the smooth scrolling, Xevious really pushes the Famicom sprite hardware. There's a limit of 6 sprites on screen at once, but a lot of the targets are actually background tiles, including the giant flying saucer. The compromises from the arcade version are just a slower scrolling to compensate for the smaller play view on the television set, and a few graphical changes. Xevious feels like it could have been a Famicom game from 1986. The only catch is it is an early game. We're going to see better shooters on the system, but we won't see them for quite a while. Okay, 12,000 years ago there was a super civilization living on Earth, and they built a giant computer called GAMP. In fact, they made multiple copies of GAMP, 6 altogether. GAMP worked out that there was an ice age coming that would kill most of the people on Earth, so he took the people that he liked and moved them to another planet, thinking that it would kill off all the nonconformists. The people who moved with GAMP to a different planet all developed psychic powers, and they tried to use their psychic powers to destroy the remaining people on Earth. In the year 2000, GAMP decides it's time to go back and take over the Earth again. He finds it infested with humans, so they invade and conquer South America. Klaatu and his android girlfriend Eve contact the remaining humans to offer them help in defeating GAMP. It turns out GAMP was built by using the brain of Klaatu's father, and although GAMP is destroyed, it uses its psychic abilities to regenerate itself and enslave all the human beings. Klaatu helps the remaining free humans build a super space fighter capable of destroying the indestructible materials that GAMP builds its spaceships out of. And then they fly off to South America to fight off the enemies and destroy the flying saucer that's going to regenerate GAMP on Earth.